And I think it is the right kind of strategic warning. In fact, one of the things I am most excited about this document is that I think it truly gets the strategic threat from China right. It correctly prioritizes and understands the importance of the moon, of what they're doing on space solar power, what they're attempting to do on maneuver and counter space.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter.
The U.S. Space Force finally released two hyped and highly anticipated major documents. And while I can understand that the two documents may not seem all that exciting, here's the thing. They will serve as a conceptual guide to what the Space Force believes could be the nature of the threats it will face, where these threats may be, and what it will need to deter aggression against U.S. interests out to at least the cislunar region. They are two halves of a crystal ball based on research, analysis, and likely some very interesting internal debates. These guides may feel to some a little like science fiction, and they should, as the time frame is over the course of the next 15 years. For others, especially those who are leading or building space companies or investing in them, 15 years may be just about right to create and build the deep tech kit and the logistics systems this service branch thinks it's going to need. The first title is the Future Operating Environment 2040. The 68 pages represent, quote, a conceptualization of a future where space superiority efforts will contend with new technologies and trends and enhance threats while performing new and legacy missions, unquote. It paints pictures of possible futures, and some have already started calling it the FOE. The accompanying title is called the Objective Force 2040. The purpose of this second document is to discuss what the Space Force will need in terms of budget, personnel, material, and technology to secure U.S. interests into and through space. The 104 pages contain a lot, but the parts regarding orbital warfare and electronic warfare are classified. In a press conference at this week's Space Symposium, the Space Force Chief of Space Operations, General Chance Saltzman, said that these two documents would be amended annually and that every 5 years, a snapping of the chalk line will occur and new full editions will be published, each time looking out 15 years. The CSO emphasized that they are not perfect. He said they were written to provoke conversations about what the Space Force should do to prepare now for the future. I'd also like to point out that the subjects contained within these two documents could spur a series of episodes. This episode covers the wave tops. Joining me for this discussion are Joel Mozer, the Space Force's first chief scientist, and Peter Garretson, a space power advocate and author. Here's our conversation. Hey, Joel, Peter, it's great to have you guys back on the Downlink podcast.
Thank you, Laura.
Hey,
Great
Laura,
to be back.
I think our regular listeners already know who you two are, but let's do a quick round of introductions anyway for those who may be new listeners. And Peter, why don't you go first?
Well, I'm Peter Garretson. I'm a senior fellow in defense studies at the American Foreign Council and the author of several books on space strategy and policy.
And I am going to continue to push your latest book because it is pretty important to our discussion today. So you want to give us your latest title?
So it's Space Shock, 18 Threats That Will Define Space Power. And it is all about the future operating environment that the Space Force and the nation will face, and has just made the Space Force's NSSI reading list.
Oh, congratulations. That's great news.
Thank you.
And Joel, what about you?
Well, I'm Joel Mozer, and I spent my career as a scientist and technologist with the Department of the Air Force, culminating as the chief scientist of the Space Force. These days, I spend my time thinking about the future and educating folks about strategic foresight and how to make decisions based on things that are yet to come.
And you also have the Aurora project, right? I mean, that is all about the future, which again supports what our discussion is about today. Want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a project focused primarily on the dynamic space operations and looking ahead to generation after next. So we're talking 20 years, maybe 25 years out in the future. What are operations in space going to look like? What kind of manufacturing, resource utilization, logistics networks, and what threats to resilience and adaptability to those kind of things should we think about today as we start developing that capability? So we're kind of at the beginning of that development curve. So now's the time to think about how to do it right.
And just correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole point of that is to avoid strategic technological surprise, correct?
I would even expand that to take advantage of surprise. So we know that the future is going to be disruptive. Let's get ourselves in a position to take advantage of those disruptions, not get run over by them.
Amen.
So, Joel, the U.S. Space Force released the unclassified versions of two lengthy documents. They're more than just documents, really. The first is called the Future Operating Environment, and the second one is called the Objective Force. I want us to set the stage for this discussion. And to do that, I'd like to know what is the headline for space power. If you were to sum this up into a one sentence headline, what would it say? Joel?
It would say congratulations to the Space Force. These kind of forward-looking documents that put down on paper the direction we need to go are a long time coming, and it's something that we need to do. It's something that's been needed since the inception of the Space Force, and I congratulate. It's a hard work. It's a lot of effort to put these things together and a lot of analysis. But I would also say it's just a start. It's not the final answer. We're not yet at decision grade analysis that will impress Congress and other folks. That's not to knock it. I don't want to criticize the Space Force at all, because I genuinely do appreciate the fact that these things are put out there. But let's not stop. Let's keep going on this. Now that we've expressed some positions for the future, let's analyze them and look at some alternatives and make them trade-off studies that tell us exactly what we need to invest in and what the priorities are.
And Peter, what's your headline?
Well, like Joel, I really think we are better off. Both the Space Force is better off, and the Space Enterprise is better off as a community that these two documents are out there and published. There's a lot of goodness in each, and I certainly have no lack of critique for both. But I would say that fundamentally, they give us a sense of where the Space Force's head is at and what it's currently thinking, and allow us to, hopefully make the necessary corrections in time.
And Peter, I want to stay with you here. Why are these two documents important, right? Especially for those who are not inside the Pentagon or in uniform. What does the Chief of Space Operations, General Chen Salzman, really want to get accomplished here? Because when he was at Space Symposium and, he delivered them there, he made it really clear to anyone he spoke to that they're really important to him. So why should they be important to us, and perhaps more precisely for the Space Force?
Well, I think the CSO has been very clear in his remarks that he sees this as sort of the starting place, and he charges very clearly in the Objective Force document for all Guardians to sort of red team the document and provide feedback. But here's why I think these documents are important. First of all, this is really the first long-term look since Joel's work in the Air Force 2060 that has made it to publication. And that's important because as an official document, it then gets read by all the members. And that puts, I would say, sort of the ceiling on what conversations they're allowed to have. And so I would say, in particular, the future operating environment raises the bar of the types of conversations that junior Guardians and Guardians across the board are able to have. Likewise, it sends a clear message to Congress about where the Space Force thinks they should be going in the long term and what they're going to be asking for in the future. So it's a useful sort of preview and opening. It sends that same sort of message to allies and partners about where the Space Force is trying to go and where they can potentially add capability. And the document's very explicit about that. And then finally, it sends a clear message to industry about where the Space Force thinks it's going, and it will help them focus on where they're going. So that's kind of, the major buckets of why I think it's important. It does also, in theory, send a message to adversaries and neutrals, but I would not say that it has done a particularly strong job on that score.
And Joel, who else should be reading them? I mean, is this something that perhaps even engineers and scientists should read to guide their work? Maybe even venture capital investors who maybe would find them useful to discern whether a new technology is worth pursuing, whether it's a good investment. I mean, who else needs to read this?
Definitely, technologists of all stripes, whether they're in the service or in industry, and commercial entrepreneurs should be looking at this as sort of some directionality to where we're headed, and identify the kind of things that are identified here that they can contribute to, and hopefully add to the conversation about the details of this. As I mentioned before, this is really just almost a set of vision documents that say we're headed in this direction. There's an important point here. When you're talking about the future, you can ask several questions. One of them is, what do you think the future is likely to be? And the answer to that question is probably it's going to look a lot like today, just extrapolated a little bit. It's going to be more of what we have today. And you can use intelligence estimates to take a look at where competitors are and what the emerging threats are. And that's basically what the future operating environment is. There's a couple other questions you could ask, though. What do you want the future to be? What do you aspire it to be? That's a whole different future. And that depends on your values and what you hold dear and what you want to contribute to life in general, not just national security. So that would give you a different set of answers. And then there's a third set of questions, which is, what could the future be like, given the fact that there's always disruptions? Things change that we don't expect. What are the plausible things that could surprise us and pop up? And that's yet a different set of futures that you can think about. And the truth is, you have to think about all three of those. If you ignore the most likely future, then you're exposing yourself to risk that you may not survive to get to the most desirable futures. And if you don't think about what those desirable futures are, you don't know what to drive towards. You don't know what to invest in to push us in the direction. And I'll just reference things like Artemis 2, where we've gone back to the moon, and we have national ambitions to go beyond Earth and to return to the moon and Mars and things like that. Those are visions and aspiring futures. But things could happen along the way that we are just not prepared to react to at this point. And so, bringing all this back, we need to mature those documents so they're not just visions of the likely future, but they have some adaptability into it. So when those disruptions or changes happen, we have a plan in place and capabilities in place to resolve those challenges quickly and take advantage of them. Because, in this world of technological advancements coming faster and faster and changes happening very fast, it's who makes the changes and adapts fastest that's really going to win. And I don't see that in the current documents. We need to work on that.
All right. Well, seeing that we're really talking a lot about the future, let's talk a bit more about the future operating environment document. So there's a lot in there. And I know that you have even more to say about it than what you just said, actually. So what stands out the most to you in the future operating environment? We have unrestricted spectrum warfare. We have the possibility that China will implement brain-computer interfaces, which I know is something of interest to you, Joel. There's metamaterials and, of course, artificial intelligence. But for you, Peter, there's even space-based solar power. And what I liked about, at least the framing was that the framing was all about deterrent effects, in the sense that when they were talking about these different technologies in the document, there was the word, and it was in bold, deterrent. That could prevent the United States and the allies from freely using space or traversing space to reach destinations off-world. That seems to me that this document is actually a very serious warning that we so rarely see issued from any military branch. So, Joel, how credible is that threat assessment?
I think it nails the nature of the future fight. It's going to be contested. Things are going to get degraded. It's going to move fast, and trust is going to be something that's very fragile. We're not going to know what to trust and what not to trust. Our decision timelines are going to be compressed, and all those things are called out in the future operating environment. One piece of it that maybe it's could stand a little more work on is how adaptive is our adversary. So it does call out China as the pacing threat. And
not new,
but the thing about having a technological peer adversary is they're going to adapt too. So how do they respond to the world that we're building in this future operating environment, and how do things change? Adversaries are going to shape that domain too. And I think the FOE talks to that, but doesn't really address how we're building an architecture to respond to that.
Well, just to be a pain in the ass, wouldn't that be in the objective force?
Yeah, and I would like to propose a concept. The objective force is an important concept. That's taking a look at the most likely future. This is the design, the force that we need, so to speak. That's sort of a minimum viable product. That's not the full answer. I would like to propose a new term, the adaptable force design, the AFD, which starts with the objective force design, but then looks at the trades, looks at the game of chess, where we make a move and our adversaries make a move. So how do we adapt to that move? And that means having built-in decision points and flexibility in our systems and reserve capability planned out in advance that we can take advantage of.
And Peter, I want to know from you, is this a warning? And I'm talking about the future operating environment first, because we're going to get to the objective force part in just a few minutes. But yeah, is this a warning about, hey, this is coming and we need to get after it?
Laura, it's absolutely a warning, and I think it is the right kind of strategic warning. In fact, one of the things I am most excited about this document is that I think it truly gets the strategic threat from China right. It correctly prioritizes and understands the importance of the moon, of what they're doing on space solar power, what they're attempting to do on maneuver and counter space. And I also think that, if I were to give you a headline about this document, the most exciting line in the entire document is on page II, and it says, the Space Force's mandate is to ensure freedom of action and navigation across the Earth-Moon system to protect the lines of communication and to deter aggression with credible combat power, right? That is the first time we have seen an official document actually embrace, what Joel has called the dual mandate. And it's right there. I wish that were repeated in the objective force, which it's not. But that is very strong and powerful language. Now, what this document, I think, gets right is a good understanding of the emerging strategic environment, at least that's being pushed by our adversaries. Where I think it gets lost is, or where I think there's, important omissions is there's very little about the innovations that our own private industry is currently attempting to do and how massive those are likely to shift in terms of space launch and data centers and our own companies trying to do space solar power. And there's very little about what we think is already sort of in the cards, right? There's nothing about how, global missile defense is going to, you don't even really see the proliferated warfighter space architecture or the new RGXX And there's nothing about AMTI or GMTI, or Oracle, right? Which should all be, part of this vision of what is sort of the operating environment, the pieces that are going to be on the board, in this 2040 timeframe. Artemis isn't there, right? And I think that's sort of a critique of both documents, is that it doesn't really seem as if either document assumes the success of either the Artemis moon base or of Golden Dome.
And how about the Chinese side of it, though? Because the Chinese are planning to go to the moon and have a laboratory there, right? I mean, it's a joint. It's the ILRS. I mean, does it address the fact that they're planning to go to the moon?
It does, actually. It addresses an awful lot, except for their plans for a mass driver and their massive plans for a $10 trillion Moon Earth economic zone. It does understand that they're going to do nuclear stuff on the moon. And it even acknowledges at the very end that a game changer could be moon-based weapons in one of the tables. But it doesn't seem to assume much action on the part of the United States commercial or civil sector.
Yeah, and if I can just riff on that a little bit, I agree. Both the FOE and the OFD are really focused on the warfighting environment. So it's a lot about how we fight wars in space. But I would posit the Department of War has other roles too, and that's to provide security and deterrence in, from, and to space. And that's where all these other things come in. If we truly are building, through our civil exploration capabilities, the ability to have a larger presence on the moon, the Space Force needs to think about that. How do they protect that, and how do they provide deterrence from somebody threatening that? So it's just another way to say what Peter's saying.
Or it could also possibly be missing is, what are we fighting for?
Yes. I mean, there are two comments here, Laura. One is in the CSO's remarks at Space Symposium. He has this wonderful line that, if U.S. interests move somewhere, the Space Force is going to be there, right? And I really, have been waiting a long time for the Space Force to message that. And, like I said, that line in the FOE, seems to indicate something similar. I would have liked to have seen, similar strong language. But overall, I would say that is another beef I have with both of these two documents, is just what Joel said, is even though they get the strategic threat from China very right, and clearly show how China is attempting to eat our lunch in strategic competition, I would say, first of all, the objective force fundamentally misunderstands and misuses the term strategic competition as if it's merely a posturing for future warfare rather than an ongoing attempt to secure strategic ends below the threshold of armed conflict. And so both documents end up being completely defensive, where the adversary, the competitor, has the advantage in peacetime, and we are sort of just reacting. And you don't see the type of deliberate positioning toward the future that we want and advancing U.S. end states in the way that I would really like to have seen.
Something else that also has been talked about, discussed a lot, that was a most immediate reaction, and that was the sheer numbers of spacecraft, mostly satellites in the tens of thousands. But I wonder if rather the really important part of that discussion has been missed. And this is a really clunky way of getting after this point. But while the numbers make the headlines, I think the logistics, which I think goes to what you were saying, Joel, about the technologies, and you too, Peter, but the logistics that support those numbers, that support those constellations, whether they're real now or coming in the future, is really where the meat of this is it not? And it's not just launch, it's manufacturing of satellites, but it's also in-space services, right? It says, quote, "The future operating envelope will expand beyond familiar orbits to the Earth-Moon system, where logistics, refueling, and resources are likely to become instruments of statecraft and coercion," unquote. Essentially, logistics and the infrastructure for those logistics, and not just here on the ground, but in the cislunar space, neighborhood, could be a real decider, right? I mean, it's really who gets their logistics in order. That's who's going to be dominant. Am I reading that right?
I think you are. Yeah, I think the future operating environment totally gets that framing right. And in fact, you see a little bit of that repeated very briefly in the strategic framing of the objective force. And they do a very clear job showing how China is actually doing this.
I mean, we're
So I
talking
was very
ISAM and OSAM operations, just to be clear, right? I mean, we're talking about logistics in space. I mean, that's a
well.
whole
Let me just
sector
point
of
out that,
staff.
that this is a mixed bag. So I would say that I would say that the need for space mobility and the need for space logistics are strongly called out in the future operating environment. Not so sure that they're addressed in any way in the objective force. But ISAM is more than just servicing and logistics, right? It is, in space assembly and manufacturing. And there I would say, like, this document is super weak on anticipating, the potential disruptive environment for the Space Force when you've got, companies and countries able to build kilometer scale structures.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to beat up on either one of these documents because it's great. And I do think the FOE gets the environment right about the number of satellites. And it talks about even things like the traffic management and the potential for orbital debris problems coming up. I don't think the objective force design has got there yet. I don't see a whole lot of support to what to do about those kind of things, just those basic things. Nonetheless, the large logistics networks, I have this vision of the future of space. It's going to look more like the Port of Long Beach, things coming and going and busy and active and material coming and going in multiple ways. That's one potential future of space that will need national security protection and support. I don't see that in the Objective Force 9. But again, they've laid the foundation for it. So I think there's an opportunity to put it in as we go forward.
All right. Well, let's get after that objective force. So the objective force document, for everybody who's out there, is the document that discusses what the Space Force thinks it needs to meet the challenges in the future at 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. They break it up into these 5-year epochs, right? And it should be useful for the American people via Congress, through budgets. And I'd also like to note here that the CSO said that the biggest challenge was actually getting a regularized annual budget. He said continuing resolutions kill speed, but putting the budgets aside, the objective force document is the Space Force's blueprint to achieve what it calls space control, and that's military speak for contesting and controlling geography in space, for effects in space, but also on Earth and possibly on the moon. It does kind of touch on the moon, but it's, as you guys have noted, it is pretty darn light. The Space Force is describing itself as a service that will directly enable lethal fires in all domains, tracking targets to close long-range kill chains. It also calls for a doubling of the force end strength. That's the total number of Guardians, uniformed and civilian. And right now, the Space Force has more than 15,000 Guardians. So when you read this, and we've just been discussing different parts of it, but if you had to choose a thing, what stands out to you the most?
Well, for me, it's my impression that these two documents were worked in parallel rather than using the future environment as an input to the objective force. It's very hard to draw a line and say, okay, because of our assumptions about the future operating environment, this is what we need to design for the objective force, and here's the objective force that meets that, right? The language is very, very different between the two documents. As an example, you mentioned, the moon and cislunar. So, in the future operating environment, the moon or cislunar or XGU is mentioned like 40 times. And in the much longer objective force, all those words are mentioned only 7 times and only in the context of space domain awareness. Coming from an Air Force background where I was dealing with the Air Force's objective force structure in the early 2000s, I was sort of expecting it to have something, a kind of clarity like, we want to have 1735 F-35s and 381 F-22s and 179 KCXs, right? And I was kind of really hoping that it would be like, we want to have, this many offensive space control platforms, and we want to have, this number of, satellites in cislunar. And in many ways, the document is more and less than that, right? I mean, it does have these long, charts and attached XLS documents. But to me, for all the good words that were said in the future operating environment, and then a few of them that were repeated in the strategic framing, it's like, okay, but where really is the servicing? Where's the logistics? Where's the maneuver? There are some, shaded words, but like I would have expected, much larger upfront, bragging about AMTI, about GMTI, about Golden Dome.
And you want to explain what AMTI and GMTI are real quick?
So radar in space that can see targets that move on the ground, and radar in space that can see and control aircraft or see aircraft from above, so that an air battle manager can direct fires to and from those aircraft.
Yeah, and if I could just sort of follow on that, your question is illuminating, Laura. So you asked what stands out in the objective force design. Part of the issue is nothing stands out because they haven't done the trades. They haven't got that far. Again, it's work to be done. They need to put the analytical rigor into, would you rather have a capability to do cislunar SDA or a proliferated missile warning capability? I mean, those are trades that Congress is going to need to see. We can't just say we need to double our budget. We need to say what are the specific capabilities that we're going to do. And there's a lot of work left to do there. There's, we have to develop the concepts around them. We have to war game them, figure out where the value is versus the cost. One of the things that's been very hard, and it was extremely hard when I was the chief scientist, is relative value across mission areas. So how do you compare a capability in, say, positioning, navigation, and timing to defensive space control or something like that? And unfortunately, we haven't got there yet. But it's something that's going to be needed if we have a mature, well-architected Space Force.
Well, let me just ask you guys this, though, right? We know that this isn't the full future, or rather objective force document, right? We know that there are parts that are classified. We know that the offensive counter space capabilities is classified. We know that orbital warfare and electronic warfare, they're classified. Do you think we're just not able to see that and they just didn't want to, lift up their skirt and show us a little leg? Or do you think there really isn't anything there?
Oh, there's definitely work going on there, and it's important work. And obviously we can't talk details about any of that, but I would say a lot of that is maturing as in real time. There's a lot of prototype test capabilities that we put in these sort of classified environments. Some of them need to be there, some of them don't. But the full nature of what we need in an objective or an adaptable force design, it still needs to be developed, just as the rest of the objective force design. So there's a lot of work going on there. And kudos to places like the Space Force's Space Warfighting and Analysis Center. They're the group that's been tasked with doing all of this analysis, both on the classified and unclassified sides, and putting all this together. And it's a monumental task, and they're doing yeoman's work to get it done, and they will continue to do it, hopefully, for the nation.
Well, the objective force also says a lot about missile warning and tracking, and it does mention Golden Dome, but it doesn't really say it more than once, I believe, right? And it does raise the question of space-based interceptors. But the thing is, it doesn't really resolve it, right? It says that the requirements remain uncertain. And given that Golden Dome is the administration's signature defense initiative, where does that actually leave us?
Well, this was one of the things that really stood out to me, is that this document, if anything, rather than a full embrace, seems very hesitant on Golden Dome. Like I'll read this line. It says, the Space Force can accept missile defense as a formal mission area, but the specific requirements necessary to accomplish fire control remain uncertain. If the Space Force builds space-based interceptors or supports their employment, it should undertake a focused study on the specification required to do so.
I mean, that really is at arm's length, isn't it?
That is pushing it away as hard as possible in my view. So I was truly surprised given the executive order, 2 executive orders, and the potential utility here. That's and then just an aside on your last question. I'm disappointed that it's 2026, right? 6 years after the Space Force, and we now have designations for like attack and pursuit, weapon systems, right? Why is it
we've
that
got cute new names for them too?
Yes, that the Army and Navy and Marines and Air Force can all say, I'm going to buy X number of fighters, and we can't just say we're going to buy 6 pursuit, spacecraft in the Space Force. It just seems silly.
All right. Well, then that gets to the big enchilada question, right? You just mentioned it, executive orders, right? President Trump signed an executive order in December that was pretty clear. It directed the U.S. government to secure American interests in, from, and to space, from very low Earth orbit through cislunar and beyond. I mean, do these 2 documents, they do support it, but kind of, right?
Yeah, and you got to keep in mind, the executive order is bigger than the FOE or the force design. It includes the lunar presence, that NASA is developing, nuclear power in space, industrial base expansion, and all those things. And these 2 documents just released by the Space Force are really focused on the warfighting.
On the Space Force, right.
The warfighting part. So you got to keep that in mind. But there are a couple of things that the executive order calls out that I think are undertreated in the Space Force documents. One of them is, executive order explicitly calls out the need for responsive and adaptive architectures. And going back to my earlier comments, we have an architecture. I'm not sure we have an adaptive architecture at this point.
Why don't you make the distinction then? What is an adaptive architecture? Why is that different?
So we talk about resilient and robust capabilities. So that's the ability to survive a hit. Something happens and we can rebuild. But how do we now adapt to the change in the world or the disruption? And so that means pre-planning branches and sequels to our capability. It means having some reserve capacity in mind. And you and I have talked about this before, Laura, on the show. A lot of that, I look to American universities to help think through what are the adaptive capabilities that will help us take advantage of disruptions and not be threatened by them. Because it's a lot to ask the service to deal with that on their own. And I think when you're talking about next generation after that, there's a lot of help that the smart people in our universities can help with. And we've made a lot of contacts between Space Force and universities to do just that.
Peter, does it meet the executive order? Oh, gosh, I can see. If you all could see what I'm seeing right now, there's a big, huge, toothy grin. And it's, take it.
No, it doesn't. If I were sitting in the White House, and the assistant to the president for science and technology, I would not be happy. They call out a lot of. I would have been looking for something very different. I would have been looking for the future operating environment to assume the success of my initiatives and to call out what are the strategic vital economic interests that the Space Force has to protect, which is in the executive order. I would have expected a much greater treatment about the threat of a nuclear weapon in space that's specifically called out. And I would have, expected, it's very clear that you've got to protect from VLEO to cislunar, and I didn't see VLEO. I saw cislunar in the future operating environment, but not really an assumption of like, hey, here's the new Artemis moon base that we're going to have, and that's how it's going to change the future operating environment. And, cislunar is very weak in the objective force, which was a surprise because I figured like, if anything ought to have stood out from the executive order to influence the forthcoming objective force, it should have been that.
And it's really weird. I'm just going to break in real quick. It's really sort of strange because these 2 documents were supposed to come out by the end of 2025, right? And I suppose they must have gotten wind in the Pentagon that the executive order was coming out in December and held back, which makes a lot of sense because you don't want to get, in front of the president. Okay, cool. But then Salty also said in the press conference that he talks all the time to Jared Isaacman at NASA. So would have been informed that, the Artemis program is changing and it is speeding up way back when. So yeah, it is missing, isn't it?
Yes. And then the other, big enchilada that's missing, for which I just find no explanation in the objective force. In fact, I believe the Air Force leadership in their Q&A at Space Symposium were very plain that they did not have a plan for space nuclear, right? So Trump 1 put out a space, nuclear strategy that tasked the DoD. They had, 5 years to work on it. Apparently did nothing. And then, they have a new, space nuclear thing, and it's called out in the executive order. And so, for there to be like, zero plan, even when they're calling out, China's investment in space nuclear, just strikes me as like, I would have thought that there would have been, some greater address in this. So, I mean, and then the other thing is like, to Joel's point about, it tasks a strategy to develop, a resilient infrastructure, as well as like there's an implied task for all government agencies to sort of help, not just protect, but help build the space economy. And both of these documents basically see commercial only as in somebody who's supplying something to them, rather than like, how can the Space Force be used to catapult our strategic competition success in the interim and build those vital interests in the future we want, that Joel was talking about. So,
but it does say it's going to protect the commercial interests, though.
Well, and that's another,
and that's new.
Well,
because before I thought, everybody in the commercial industry would felt like they were kind of, flying out there and hoping not to get hit.
Yeah, I probably would not have phrased in an open document that, dual use commercial space assets are legitimate targets. I probably would not have written something like that down.
All right, you two. We are well over time, and now is a good time to close this off. So I want to thank you both, Peter, Joel, for making the time to come on the podcast.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Laura.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.